Well, hello there, woman beings, and welcome back to the Woman Being Podcast. I am your host today, Kelly Ann, and as always, I am here with Kelly.
Good morning.
And Emma.
Hello, beautiful people.
And we are going to be talking about the ever-important, ever-present, ever-needed conversation around the importance of consent. So without further ado, we're just going to dive right in.
Consent to listening to this episode.
Let's go. If you want to.
Only if you want to.
This is Woman Being,
where we explore thoughts and opinions
and have the freedom to change our minds
without expectation or judgment.
We will hold a safe space and support each other
as we navigate together in the form of feminine.
To start us all off, just at the beginning, this is going to be a little bit of probably a triggering episode because we're talking about consent. We're going to probably be bringing up sexual harassment, sexual misconduct, all those types of things. So if that's rough for you, maybe just sit out of this one, but that's okay. We've got great other pieces of content for you to consume. So just go back through the archives, check out what you've been waiting to check out, and it'll be a good day for you. So, but also, while you're at it, make sure that you're following us on our social media platforms. We are on Instagram, we are on TikTok, we are on multiple podcasting platforms as well as YouTube. So if you ever want to watch our faces while we have conversations, you can do that.
on YouTube and Spotify.
On YouTube and Spotify, which is amazing. So, and the reason you should definitely be following us, especially on Instagram, is because this is actually a listener recommended topic. So we are always getting feedback and insight from you guys. We really want this to feel like a two-way conversation and like you actually get to sit at the table with us. And so you can't do that if you're not following us on Instagram.
It's true. It's true.
Make sure you're doing that.
Yeah. The power is in your hands.
You, the people.
You get a say. And we want you, the woman beings, to tell us what you want.
And this is such a great episode topic that for whatever reason had not crossed any of our minds.
Totally.
Which is kind of shocking to me, but the topic of consent. Of course, this is a woman being topic. It's something that I'm sure a lot of people are curious about. And especially as we're approaching it from our formerly conservative or, open-minded, questioning perspective. I'm sure we all have great experiences to contribute.
Oh, I'm sure. I'm sure. Many opportunities in life to give and receive consent.
Absolutely.
Very important. So on that note, how did you guys first learn about consent? When did that happen? What was that conversation? Was it a conversation? Because I feel like when we were younger, it might not have necessarily been.
Oh, yeah. So the first time I'd ever been introduced to the construct known as consent today was in college, actually.
Wow.
There had never been any sort of sit-down conversation about, this is what, this is how you have a safe conversation about.
No means no.
Yeah. Sexual interaction, physical interaction. And at the time, for me, as I alluded to just a second ago, it was very foreign. At that point in my life, I was already married. As you guys, if you want to check out our episode on Kelly Tells All on her teen wedding, I did get married at 18. And so I was married for a couple of years at that point, and was training to be a CA, which is essentially the Iowa State version of an RA, which I think is a more familiar term for people. But they had to do a whole course on consent, or a whole, I don't know. It was part of our training. And so, I was like, I've been married for 2 years, and never in my 2 years of marriage have either one of us ever given consent. So, we don't ask those questions. So why is that necessary? And, so I had a lot of, I balked at a lot of it. And I think there's a lot of it that I was like, yeah, I guess that applies if you're, having sex with strangers, I guess. And that was sort of the only, I was like, that's the only reason that makes sense. Mm-hmm. But anyways, that was where I learned about it.
Wow.
Yeah. I think that it seems like there tends to be a lot of Christian, sort of like writing off of consent because it's like, well, first of all, you shouldn't be having sex with people that you're not married to. And then once you're married, why would you need consent at all? And so I can see how that would be like such a foreign thing to you coming into that.
And it wasn't until much later that I really understood that like that there could be rape within marriage and what that could look like. I think I knew it on a conceptual level, but like in my mind I was like, we love each other. And so, and then the church also teaches like you become one flesh. And so there's a lot of,
you can't
there's
rape
a lot
yourself.
of surrounding, a lot of surrounding teaching that's not necessarily biblical. Extra biblical is the word that is like, oh, therefore when he wants to have sex, you have sex. And when you want to have sex, he has sex. And you guys just have to be of one mind. And his body's your body and your body's his body.
Yeah. Well, and it was taught to me that like, well, that's a part of your vows.
Yes.
To give yourselves to one another.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh my God, that meant sex? Like, I was like, oh my God. Like, you just automatically now have the right to my body.
Yeah.
Is
And I
really
think that
odd.
was very much what I had been taught to understand for sure. And I don't think it ever resulted in any like harmful sexual situations within my marriage. So I just want to clarify that with. But that was definitely my perception. And for sure within the context of a abusive or unhealthy or tense sexual situation within a marriage, that could be very harmful if someone does not understand their right to say no. Or their obligation to ask.
Yeah. And I'm sure we'll dive into that more as we keep talking about
Absolutely.
consent. But I don't really remember when I first heard about consent as a concept. I like tried to rack my brain and I'm like, I remember a lot of education in school about, drugs and alcohol, but I don't remember a ton about consent. When I think about like our sexual education classes and stuff, it was like a lot about contraception and about childbirth, but not a lot about consent. Yep. So they may have touched on it, but it was not something that stuck out to me. And the only other like sphere that I could think of hearing that was like in Dare. Do you guys remember Dare? Did you ever do Dare? You didn't. Well,
My brother did it. I
Dare
did
to be
not,
drug free. DARE. I forget what it's like. Drugs, alcohol, RE.
I did hear about that.
Yeah, with the lion. I still have a Dare T-shirt.
What?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, anyways, it was just like a drug education program that was in a lot of schools back in the day.
It was like the purity culture of drugs.
Yeah.
It's like, you like make a pledge to
like not do drugs.
Yeah, to be abstinent towards drugs.
Yeah, you do. Get your drug ring.
You lock away your drug
promise
use in your
not
heart.
to do cocaine. Yeah. Like, you probably shouldn't be anyways, so.
I mean, lots of people do cocaine, though.
Well, yes, lots of people do, but.
So anyways, I don't remember really ever learning about it. I don't remember hearing about it from my parents or hearing about it within my church. The earliest time that I can remember really hearing about consent was also in college, like sort of as like the Me Too movement was happening and like hearing about these women that were sexually assaulted, that were raped, that were abused. And it was like, oh, this was non-consensual. And I don't remember being particularly shocked by the idea of consent, but it definitely, because like I had practiced consent without realizing it. Like I had done that in past relationships, but I didn't realize that that was what it was, or I didn't really have terms to it, or I hadn't thought about it that deeply. So it wasn't like a relevant thing to me when I first heard about it.
No, it is really interesting. I also don't remember when I actually knew the word consent and understood what it meant. I mean, in theory, I was kind of taught consent in ministry school, but like it's that weird Christian thing of like, well, you're supposed to be abstinent, so you actually don't like need consent, basically. But we were taught like, oh, if you ask to pray for someone, you ask like, may I pray for you? Yes or no? May I put my hand on you? And so that was really reinforced. Like, you can't just go around touching people, which is interesting because that environment was very touchy-feely, and I would argue, like, too touchy-feely. But But like with other people, it's like, oh, if it's someone outside of our environment, you need to make sure to ask. So that was like interesting in and of itself. But I think that I remember really understanding what consent is and what it means when I was like 22 or like 23 maybe, because maybe earlier, maybe like 21, because I was a manager at a Victoria's Secret. I was the youngest manager, the youngest, newest manager, and we had to have like, all of the sexual harassment training and stuff, and I believe that was brought up quite a bit. Like, what is consensual outside of work versus what is not consensual inside of work, like, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, and then, but I remember continuing to learn about consent because in my mind, I was like, there's sex and there's rape. Like, and there's actually that in-between space is the consent conversation. And I never really bridged that gap,
Yeah, I was going to say I had like a really strong understanding of like, this is my body and no man is allowed to cross these boundaries without like hearing from me about it,
Yes.
Well, really it would be not even, I mean, I would argue it wouldn't even be hearing from you about it. It'd be like hearing from God about it. And hearing from the priest or pastor that has married us about it.
I mean, I had been raised with this sense of I must defend my...
protect your own.
Yeah, I must protect my body or, whatever from like creepy...
Old
or maybe
dudes.
not even creepy, but maybe just like...
on
women.
Like
anybody who's not my husband, whatever. But like, I never learned consent with women.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Like it wasn't ever taught that a woman could violate consent.
Yeah.
And so, I kind of had this, like, I remember being very bold, like in high school or middle school of like, I don't know.
Virginity Rocks t-shirt.
Well, but like being like, no, you cannot touch me like that.
Yeah.
And if guys were being inappropriate, I would be like, get away from me,
Yeah.
And so I was very like, don't touch me. Or like I felt safe to say don't touch me, but like it wasn't framed in the context of consent and like mutual like two people trying to navigate their physical relationship. That was never the context. It was more so like keep out the weirdos.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which like
and so it was the extreme, and that was what rape was framed for me. Rape is this extreme strangle you, hold you down.
Which is typically not the case.
Which is almost always, like mostly
sexual assault and harassment almost always happens in a situation where there's power dynamics and where the other person is not necessarily like freaking out and fighting, but they are in freeze or they have sort of decided to bear through this moment in order to survive. And it's not necessarily like, or it's that they're receiving maybe some sort of affirmation that they don't receive anywhere else. And they don't have, like a child doesn't have the like brain functions, the experience to recognize like, oh, this is sexual abuse or this is inappropriate. But I would even argue too that like what you're talking about and like saying no to be like abstinent and pure, whatever, like isn't really a true like consent situation.
I agree. I totally agree.
It's because to me, consent is not just saying no. Like consent is deciding what you want. And it's like choosing, yes, I do want you to touch me, or no, I do not want you to touch me. And in that, you didn't have a choice. It was told to you, the answer is always no.
Yes, absolutely.
And it was told to you, like, just be an absolute, like, wall of purity.
Yes, absolutely.
And you don't get a choice. We have made it for you.
Yes,
Yeah.
there
So
is
that's
no
not
yes. There is no
consent.
yes in purity culture, I think.
Yeah.
Like, depending on who you ask, you can hold hands or whatever. But like, I don't think that's true consent either. I think it was a very truncated, like pared down version of consent that I understood. Like I understood how to say no to the creeps, but it did not occur to me like how to say no to someone that I trust.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that whole concept of the creeps is like It's just so frustrating because it's like not the case.
And it's such a dichotomy of human good and bad and whatever that isn't helpful. But
Totally.
But it's also interesting when you guys talk about like being in a church and asking for consent, like for putting your hand on somebody and things like that. Like my church that I was in high school, I don't recall ever asking for consent for something like that. Like they never asked, like if someone asked for prayer, there was never the question of like, could I put my hand on you to pray for you? There was never that question. Or like even like for the most part, hugging people like as they walked in. I remember I think that we have touched on a lot of these things in our like purity culture episodes, which you guys should listen to. And modesty and all those things, it all intersects. But I remembered like choosing to stop hugging boys because I didn't want them to feel my breasts on their chests, right? And it was like a big deal that I chose to not do that because everyone else in the church would like hug freely and whatever. And I was sort of seen as a bit odd because I would say no to hugs from boys.
Yep.
And it was like odd. In some ways, it was sort of like praised because it was like, look how pure she is. Yeah. But it wasn't like people like argued or like pushed back, but it was definitely like, oh. And it was like a shock that someone would say no to this physical touch.
Yep.
And so it was like I was an outlier within my congregation about that.
Yeah, no, I will clarify. I think why we were so instructed to do that is because we had some not great things happen in the community. I don't know that for certain, but internally, it was kind of like a free-for-all. So it was not practiced within the four walls as much, but definitely practiced outside of. But I didn't know about consent really at that time, but I found myself making similar choices. Not as strong as like, I'm not going to hug any man, but being like, no, I'm actually not comfortable hugging you. Like, I don't like know you.
Yeah.
Like I actually like, and so it wasn't in my mind at the time, it wasn't like a following of consent and autonomy. It was more like, I'm just not comfortable with this. And I actually don't want to be forced into doing something that I'm not comfortable doing. But it is interesting watching people like process your boundary. And like, it definitely seemed like, oh, well, something's like wrong with you.
Oh, she must be really scarred. Or,
there's
she
some
must
sort of
be
trauma
really
there.
hurting. Yeah, something like that.
And you're just like, fuck off. Like, piece of shit. So.
I mean, I think too that like, it's interesting because when you talk about like hugging people at church, like it was this idea, like even if it made you a little uncomfortable, you just sort of like did it. And so I remember thinking like, oh, I'm gonna have to hug like all these people and whatever. And like, I'm not a very physical person. Like I am more on the physical touch side, I think, than a lot of people, but it was just like, oh, I'm gonna have to hug all of them, you know, like, and it felt like, and there was never the thought of like, oh, maybe we won't hug. It was like, oh, I'm gonna have to deal with this.
Yes.
And once I had drawn like a purity line, it was easier to be like, no, because, you know, essentially God has said no. But like, that was like the only justifiable reason.
Right. Like as if you can't make a decision for yourself, like just because of your preference or, you know, whatever your level of comfortability, it has to be some sort of like power bigger than you to stop the forces of men giving you hugs.
Which is so sad that like you need
even women.
that.
I mean, there were women I didn't want to hug too.
Well, sure,
like it wasn't like it was just a male thing.
But you don't necessarily get to be like, well, purity, women, back away.
Yeah, no, it was just like, I don't get a choice in this. I'm just going to have to do it. And that's uncomfortable and whatever. But like, I guess I have to hug them.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So then along those lines, how would each of you personally define consent, and how do you actually practice it today in your life?
Yeah, that's great. The second part of the question is a good question. But for the first part, I think consent is simply defined as the act of asking someone for permission to participate in physical intimacy. And sometimes I think consent can even apply to like emotional intimacy as well. Like, do you mind, like, may I talk about this topic? You know, I think it's sometimes important.
Yeah, I even think like asking someone about something personal and giving them like, you definitely don't have to disclose
is it okay
this.
if I ask?
Yeah.
So I think that it can apply to more situations than just physicality. I think in its, I think when people hear consent, it typically specifically references verbal mutual consent before sexual intercourse or like sexual touch. And how do I practice that in my life? I don't know. Do you guys want to add to the definition before we move into the next part of the question?
Sure.
Have you guys heard of the consent tea video?
No.
What?
It's it's this like viral YouTube video. It's like an animation about consent, and it came out like 6 years ago or something. And it is this illustration about consent through the frame of offering someone a cup of tea. And it's like a really cute video. It's very informative, and like breaks down. It's like, let's think of consent like tea. So if someone comes over to your house and you offer them a cup of tea, they have a few options of how they're going to respond. They could say, yes, I would love a cup of tea. Thank you for offering. And you make them a cup of tea, and then you give it to them, and they enjoy that cup of tea. That is consent. Then, if someone comes over and they say, no, actually, I don't want a cup of tea, don't make them a cup of tea. And that's consent. If someone says, I'm not sure if I want a cup of tea, you could go and you could brew the pot of tea for them, and you could make, like, put the milk in the tea and all of that, and by the time you bring it to them, they might say, yeah, you know, I think I do want a cup of tea, and then they can consume that cup of tea. Or they might say, no, I really just, now that I see the cup of tea, I don't want it. I don't think that I feel like tea right now. I don't want it. And that's okay, because they told you they weren't sure. Or someone could come and they could say, yes, I'd love a cup of tea. And in the time that it takes for you to brew the tea, to pour the milk, to do all the process of making the tea, you come and bring it to them and they go, sorry, I've changed my mind. I don't want the tea. You don't force the tea on them. It might be a little bit annoying because they said they wanted it before, but you still don't give them the tea because they don't want the tea. If someone says they want a cup of tea,
There's so many iterations
and you brew the tea, you make the tea for them, you come back and they're now unconscious, you don't pour the tea down their throats. You don't give them, unconscious people don't want tea. And like there's a few more iterations, but that's like the basic bones of it. And it's like,
you don't hold someone down and force tea down their
yes.
throat.
And it's like it sounds so silly, but it's like, it really should be that simple where it's like, if somebody says that they want something, then you can give that to them.
Yeah.
If they then say that they don't want it, like there was another one that was like, if someone drank a cup of tea from you last week, that doesn't mean they want a cup of tea from you now, this week. Just because they had one last week. Or just because they had tea from you once doesn't mean they want tea from you every day. Like, it's so like basic.
What about like, it would be strange for you to show up at someone's house and demand that they make you tea.
Yes, that was one I'm pretty sure it was like demand or like just show up at their house unannounced and force them to have a cup of tea. Like you don't do that. And so like to me that's like such an easy way to understand consent. It's like people get to choose what they want. And you have to listen to that. You have to cooperate with that. And there were multiple times where they just say, like, unconscious people don't ever want tea. and people don't want to wake up to tea. And so it's, things like that. It's a really good, just descriptor.
It, like, takes the pressure off a little bit.
Yes, and it helps people to understand because you would never, force people to consume something.
Right.
So why would you force them to have sex
or pressure them?
If the Queen of England, let's say, offers you tea, you're not required to drink her tea. You can still refuse. And she is not privy to your tea drinking. It's not her decision whether or not you partake of her tea.
Yeah.
Yep.
And even though you may have extra pressure to, I don't know, please her or make a good impression or whatever.
She's the Queen of England.
Yeah. there's still no requirement that you have routine. And I think for people in positions like the Queen of England may find herself with a lot of power and money and influence, it's important that when you make offerings like that to people who don't have the same level of power and influence, that you are aware of that differential and how that person may feel, particularly obligated to say yes to your request for them to drink your tea.
Yep.
Yeah, 100%.
Absolutely. I agree with all of it. I think too, what I said earlier about like the conversation bridge, like from point A to point B.
Right.
And I think that applies to physical intimacy. I think that applies to even relational, like we mentioned. Like I've found that, and I don't think this is like consciously like, I want to make sure I get this person's consent. I just don't want people to feel like uncomfortable and like they have to answer questions from me. So I'm like, hey, if you're comfortable, may I ask? La 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 la. Not all the time, but just when I'm like, oh, like this is a potentially pretty vulnerable or intimate question. I don't want people to feel like they have to willingly give me deep, dark heart stuff, just because I ask. In the name of vulnerability, you know what I mean? Like, I think that's the word vulnerability is also used a lot to violate relational consent as well. I think, we talk about this actually, like, if anyone's in a corporate environment, they've been through sexual harassment training. And there are actually subjects that you can't necessarily share without potentially violating a sexual harassment policy. And so it's important to be like, is it okay if I talk about this? And so making sure you don't word vomit on people, your sexual exploits or certain types of topics can be construed as sexual harassment. Can be, not are, but can be. So it's important to for sure
read the room, be really respectful. And it's interesting. I don't think conversational topics are usually considered when it comes to consent, but I think it's all wrapped up in this like bigger idea of like mutual respect. Like I recognize that this is what I want and it may not be what you want. And it doesn't hurt me any to ask if that is something that you'd be interested in. And it doesn't hurt me any if you say no.
Totally. And I think giving people room to say no is important because sometimes people might be raised in homes or from communities where their no has not been empowered. So giving people the option, I think, is can be really powerful and really healing to helping people find their voice in that.
Yeah. And to me, like, the idea that I would later find out that somebody wasn't comfortable with something that I did or something that we talked about, like, that is heart-wrenching to me. Like, that is absolutely devastating. Like, the idea of finding out that I had violated their autonomy in some way or that I had violated what they felt comfortable with. And so to me, like, consent is for all parties involved. Like, it is to ensure, like, a safe and happy and, like, constructive situation for everyone, whether it's a sexual situation or not. And so, like, even, like, on the other side of it, as someone who would be, like, receiving that consent, I would want that, and so, like, the thought, I don't know, like, sometimes it blows my mind a little bit that people would want something that isn't consensual, you know?
And I think a lot of it can stem from insecurity. I think of this is one area where I wish I would have understood consent more at, like, growing up before I, like, officially understood what it is in my friend groups with other women. Because I had a very touchy-feely friend group in high school, and they liked to snuggle, and they liked to hug, and they liked to kiss each other on the cheek, and lean on each other and all those things. And I was less comfortable with those things. I think partially due to purity culture and being like, no, my body is a sacred whatever, and I don't participate in any of that. And I think part of it was just my personality. I think you guys know I'm not the most snuggly person. Although I do partake in forms of physical touch, but especially among friends, I'm just usually not as touchy, which is great. But I didn't understand that it was my right to say no, and they didn't understand that either. And so it kind of resulted in a lot of like manipulation and sort of like, oh, well, you don't want me to touch you, and making me feel bad for not like being a part of their thing. And then there were cases where like they would do it anyways without asking, and I would have to like suffer through it. And I just remember like that feeling of like having someone lean on you and feeling like trapped
And not wanting to be there.
super trapped.
Yep.
And not because like of sexual anything, but because like your personal space.
You didn't consent.
Your personal space is violated.
Yeah.
You know? And yeah. So I think that sort of lack of consent was depicted really well on the morning show, actually, with Steve Carell's character and the young woman that he is, I don't know, flirting with or hanging out with that day. And he sort of kind of like forces himself on her. And I remember watching that scene and just being so triggered because I resonated with how trapped she appeared to be. And I had felt that way before. And not really knowing you can just be like, hey, I'm good. And not having to be afraid of hurting someone's feelings or having them hold it against you. But I think that happened a lot to me. Is like, I could say no, and I did have a no, but it was always questioned. It was always like, I don't know, bemoaned.
Yeah.
And so it came with like an emotional burden to say no. And I think the importance of consent on both sides is holding things with open hands and not being possessive of other people, their personal space, their emotional connection with you, their sexuality, etc. It's like somebody else doesn't belong to you.
Yeah, for sure.
Regardless of how close you may be.
Yeah. And I mean, and there's definitely, like, there's reasons why people will not give consent, like you're saying, where they just feel trapped, or you feel like you don't have license to give consent in that situation. I was talking to my dad recently about the controversies surrounding Tammy Faye Baker and Jim Baker, who are famous televangelists. We actually have a movie review either coming out or already out about Through the Eyes of Tammy Faye, which is one of the movies that has Jessica Chastain is nominated for Best Actress for that role. But I was talking to my dad about it because we are from very close to the area where all of this happened. Yep. My dad was around during that time. It was in the 80s, and he remembers it very well, and like was watching the news like as all of this fallout happened. And part of the fallout with that couple was that there was this sexual impropriety, and there was a lot of pushback against the woman that came out against Jim Baker. Her name's Jessica Hahn. And she did a Playboy interview that was like detailing him raping her. And in that interview, she talks about how she had like come from a very Christian setting. She was the secretary at her small church and essentially was trafficked to Florida by Jim Baker to be raped. And she talks about how she had idolized Jim Baker. Like she had watched him on the PTL network all the time, and she like saw him as this just like this like icon of God. And when he raped her, she just like went entirely limp. Like she describes herself as being totally limp. It's very graphic in the Playboy interview that she gives, because Playboy is known for doing these like very, very long interviews. And she like went totally limp and did not give consent, you know? But it's like, but she didn't say no. And so then it was like, well, you didn't say no. And so she was criticized for that. And then another man later on in that same day was brought to the room to also have sex with her. Multiple men did throughout the time that she was there. And this other man was someone that she didn't know of. She didn't know who he was. I think that she maybe still doesn't even know who he was. But she said no to him. Like he made advances on her, and she said no, I'm not going to do that. And he stopped and he left and didn't have sex with her. And it was this idea that there wasn't that same power dynamic of her, like, feeling essentially like, I mean, she was basically told, like, she is doing something for God in having sex with Jim Baker. She is saving his marriage. She is helping him further the mission of God, like all these things. And so she felt that pressure to not give consent then, but then felt the empowerment to give consent later on with somebody that she didn't have that same power differential with. And so that's like super fascinating to me. And I think that relates to what you're talking about and feeling like there wasn't the opportunity or the safety to give consent in situations with your friends where they would lean on you or want to, I don't know, hold your hand or give you a kiss on the cheek or whatever. And that's like obviously a very different situation in terms of like the power dynamics, but it's still a situation where you're not safe to give consent. And I don't know, I think that there's so much within consent with all of that, but it's like, if people don't feel safe to give consent, that doesn't mean that they are giving consent because they're silent or because they, don't resist.
Well, and I think that's why, or that's where we circle back to like the Queen of England analogy, is that people who are in power, managers, teachers,
Presidents.
bosses, presidents, CEOs, like anybody who has a position of power over another person is, I think, responsible to take extra care in either like avoiding power dynamic sexual interaction or being very careful and very slow in your approach
Very
towards people.
communicative.
Yes, because there are people who do not have the safety to say no or yes in situations like that. And so, like, I'm a manager in my work. I would never be having sexual relations with any of my people, but, like, it's very...
You could. Like, it's not like that's...
Sure, yeah. Just like, in theory, that's, that could happen. And it's my job to be very, to stay professional in my relationship with the people that I oversee so that they are not being taken advantage of by me unknowingly. But it's my responsibility at the end of the day to be responsible.
Yeah. And that is a great way that you practice consent.
That's true.
Very true.
But, I find, in the workplace, because I'm naturally a more touchy-feely person, but it took a long time for me to realize that I'm not touchy-feely with everyone. Like, the 5 love languages things, I was always I'm physical touch. No, I am physical touch with people that I trust and that I'm close with. I don't want to touch just an average person.
Yeah,
Not interested.
I resonate with that.
Back up. But in the workplace, I find that, and my team tends to categorize me as the most quote-unquote professional of all of us, which is okay, that's a nice compliment. But I think what that translates to is I'm actually not very touchy-feely with my team. I don't really give them hugs. I tell them nice things like, hey, it's so good to see you. How was your weekend? I'm very verbally kind, but I'm not interested in touching them. And I'm that to me is a very important, maybe it's my years of being a manager, but it's a very important thing in the workplace. Actually, I don't want you to feel pressure from me touching you. I managed, a lot of girls at Victoria's Secret. I then went on to manage a few teams of people at my next employer. And I never wanted people to feel like they had to give me any kind of physical affection. And I think that just carried over into my workplace now.
Yeah. In fact, I would not argue, but I would say from my experience, I feel more comfortable giving consent in a romantic setting than in a non-romantic setting. I feel more comfortable saying no to something when it is sexual rather than saying no to something that's just friendly or whatever. Sure. There's even been instances recently where someone will who I've only met recently, or I don't really have that much relational equity with already, and they'll want to give me a hug as they leave or something like that. And it's not a huge deal, but I'm definitely a bit uncomfortable. I don't really want that. I wouldn't have initiated that hug. I wasn't asked if I wanted the hug, and I felt the pressure to receive the hug because, other people were. So, what's the big deal, And I'm not, scarred for life from this hug. So, why does it matter, you know? But for me, I actually really appreciate it when people will ask beforehand, could I give you a hug? Which I've had people do also in friendship settings and saying when you're getting to know someone, when you're still building a relationship and being is it okay if I give you a hug? Or are you a hugger? Would you want that? And in those situations, I'm actually more inclined to give them a hug, even if I knew them the same amount of time as someone else who didn't ask for a hug.
Right.
You know, I think maybe it's the breach of a hug without any sort of discussion that makes me uncomfortable more than the hug itself. And whereas within relationships that are romantic, I practice consent within that as well, in asking whether somebody feels comfortable with things, in them also asking me. I do think that I tend as a person to be a little bit more passive and kind of wait for the other person to ask rather than myself always being the asker of consent, if that makes sense. And I think some of that has to do with the patriarchal upbringing that we're within, where the man should ask or should be the one in control of a intimate situation rather than myself. The man is the initiator. And I've had that's a whole different tangent.
That's a whole other episode.
Yeah, about just what the male-female dynamic looks like in a romantic situation. But I think that there's residual from that leads me to wait for him to ask for consent or to give me the opportunity to, I'll say no to things, but I might not initiate, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I was thinking, as a follow-up to that question, how does that live out, practically in your life, right? Because Ross and I are not would you like to have sex? Yes. Okay. Can I touch you here? I think once you've developed a relationship close enough, there's, I don't know, you learn each other a little bit more. And so we're not having those types of consent talks in maybe the way that it's understood to be on a regular basis.
I think that's a bastardization of what consent is that people use to make fun of it, I think a lot of people, especially in a more conservative political space, will say oh, consent is silly because it's you're basing it down to asking a question of every single thing and sort of poking fun at it to show oh, this is preposterous in a situation to do this, and how silly, these liberals are just calling rape every moment because you didn't say these explicit words. And there is importance to, giving consent, but there's different ways to give consent.
You can do it in a sexy way, for sure.
And there's ways to build relational equity to then give consent. There needs to be more actual verbal conversation when you're giving consent to someone that you are maybe having a sexual experience with for the first time.
Right.
But if you are with someone that you have a consistent sexual relationship with, you build up what consent looks like in that relationship. And so I think, would anyone expect you and your husband to, every time that you touch each other in a different spot, ask for permission? No. But I would hope and expect that you would feel safe enough if you cross a line that you didn't feel comfortable with to say oh no, I actually don't want you to do that, oh, I don't feel like you touching my stomach right now.
Right.
Or
and I think it's more in the safety to say no or yes. I feel within our marriage there's a lot of safety to be okay, I thought I wanted this, but I really don't. I need to take a back seat. Or or
maybe you're doing something new that you haven't done before, and you're hesitant. You're trying it, and then you decide, no, I don't want to do that.
And with the safety of saying no, I think we have a much more powerful yes, where we just mutually respect and love each other. And I think we kind of have always interpreted it this way, but the idea of one body, one flesh, etc., has been translated to, if half of my flesh doesn't want this, then neither do I.
Yeah.
We are, if we're going to be mutual about this, we're going to both be on the same page. Like, we're not going to just overpower one another or whatever. But so, yeah, I think that when I first learned about consent, that felt weird. Like, do you want to have sex, husband? Why, yes, wife, let us do the sexual intercourse, you know? And I think, I mean, there's a New Girl episode that I think of where Jess, the main character, shares her virginity losing story. And she's at prom with this guy, and they're both presidents of the, like, Democrats Club or like sexual...
Oh, it was...
There's some sort of, like,
sexual
woke...
consent club of some sort.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And they, like, sit down after prom and, like, try to have sex. And it's sort of like, may I take off your dress? Yes, you may. May I? You know, whatever. And then it, like, kind of ruins the moment. And it's not sexy at all. And Jess is like, actually, no.
Which is great that you brought that up, actually. Because along that lines, do you think consent takes away from the sexiness of the moment?
I mean, I think, like, as we're talking about in the bastardized, like, poking fun way that it is often construed in, like, comedy and pop culture, yes. I don't think, I mean, if it was with a stranger, I definitely am going to want a lot more, like, verbal spoken communication if I'm getting to know someone in that way. However, you don't have to say, may I please touch your boob? You know?
I'm going to take off your shoes now if that's okay. Yeah. It's like, take off your own damn shoes.
Is it okay if I take my shirt off in front of you? You know, like, I think in the bastardized...
Like, so we're going to get naked now, yeah? Cool.
I think that there's ways to be like, hey, is this okay for you? You know, like, that feel a lot more safe, a lot more mutual respect, and don't have to feel so, like, I don't know.
Robotic.
Rigid and robotic. Yeah. But, I don't know. Does consent take away from the sexy moment?
I mean, I would say for myself, no.
I feel like being able to say yes or no in a safe space where I can, like, have a good time or not. Yeah. I think that's super sexy.
Well, and, like, me and James kind of do this, like, almost every time we have sex. We're like, you want to have sex? Is that cool? And we're like, sure. Yeah, let's do it. So, like, that in a way is consent. And James...
Not just in a way. In a way. That is consent.
That is our married version after years of having sex of consent. And it's like, you know, if we're trying something new or whatever, I'll just be like, no, let's just go back to what we were doing. But James sometimes turns me down, and sometimes I turn him down. Mm-hmm. And, you know, I'm like, damn, I'm really horny right now, but okay, I'm gonna go read a book. You know, like, that's fine. Like, there's actually nothing wrong with that. And you know what? The next time y'all have sex, it's probably gonna be fire, because that's what happens with us. It's like, oh, dang, it was a week. How'd that happen?
But I think, like, to me, it's not always verbal. Sometimes it's more like, you know, it's like the eyes.
What was that? Do you want to explain what that was?
It's the eyes, you know, it's the body language, it's the kiss on the neck, you know, like, there's ways of non-verbally propositioning sex from someone that you know well.
Yeah. Yes. And that you've built up trust and relationship with. Totally. Yeah. It's like, if we make out, I'm like, I'm seducing you. Right. That's on purpose. Yes. That's what I'm doing. Yeah. So you can decide to stop.
And if you start making out with me, I'm assuming that you're seducing me.
And then sometimes he's going to be like, babe, we're just making out. And I'm like, great. I'm done then.
So I think that being safe makes sex better. Being obligated to have sex with someone because they're your husband, not sexy.
Not interested.
I mean, maybe for him, not for me. Yeah. So,
if it is for him, then there's a problem.
Yes. And that's
it should
always
be for both of you.
That's always been the case in our marriage. And one thing I love about Ross so much, and I think should just be the norm, is that someone else is not having a good time. That should matter to you as well.
Yeah. I think the phrase I hear, and it was in reference to female orgasm, but it was that dinner's not over until everyone's had dessert. And it's that same idea of, like, we actually both sit down to enjoy the same thing. And as soon as one person's not enjoying or isn't full or hasn't had something that everyone else hasn't had, we're done. Yeah. And we're going to continue to go until it is done.
And it's actually a turnoff, I think, when somebody else is participating because they feel required.
Totally.
Yeah. Well, and, like, I mean, it would be the same going back to the tea. Yes. Or to any, like, food consumption, it's like, if your friend says, oh, I'm not really hungry, I don't want to go to dinner,
You know,
then you don't.
Or you DoorDash something just for you.
Yeah, like you don't. They may not come to dinner.
Right.
Like that's okay.
Yeah.
or if they're like choking down the tea and it's so gross and they hate it. Like,
Yeah.
Like,
that should
oh
not,
my God, don't drink my tea, please.
Like
But
that's not fun for anybody.
Totally.
So
But I think in more like, I think of you, Emma, like you're a single Pringle woman that is 30, flirty and thriving, not 30.
Whoa,
I
just age
it's the
me.
line. It's the line from 13 going on 30.
plenty, and I don't know.
It's the line from 13 going on 30.
Okay.
You don't say that?
No,
Oh,
I mean
I
I've
always
heard
say,
that line,
I'm
but
like
I wouldn't
30,
say it
flirty
about.
and thriving.
I wouldn't say it about myself because I'm
Okay.
not 30.
Apologies. You are flirty and thriving.
20, flirty, and thriving.
But like, I'm sure that that's like a whole different like can of worms for like you dating
totally.
around and seeing what's out there. And I'm like, what does consent look like for you? Do you feel like it's taken away from sexy moments, or has it added to, like me and Kelly have expressed?
Yes. So being single, flirty, not 30, but thriving.
not 30, flirty, and thriving.
Yeah.
Yes, that's how we can say it.
I'm all the other things, but not 30. Just for the record, nothing wrong with being 30, but I'm just not.
I'm excited to be 30.
I can't
Yeah.
wait.
I'm
Let's
actually
do it.
really excited.
Yes.
Yeah.
I feel like I was born to be 30.
I agree.
Wow.
You know, like
I could see that in
yeah,
you.
yeah. It's my destiny to be 30.
To be 30.
I'm like, I just can't wait to not give a shit more. You know what I mean?
Yeah, there's like, yeah. I was actually thinking about, never mind. Anyways, irrelevant. So being a single Pringle, there's definitely, I feel like maybe more situations of more explicit consent, or of just, when you're with somebody new, you're navigating like, what does this look like as we're feeling out the physical aspects of our relationship. And honestly, I find it very attractive when somebody asks for consent. Like I genuinely, every time that I've kissed somebody for the first time, they've always asked for consent beforehand. They don't say, do you, ma'am, consent to kissing me? Like that stupid trope that people have of like, but it's like, oh, like, could I kiss you? And I say, yes, you could. And then we kiss. Like, like it's great. Like I honestly, the idea of like, which I know that people do this all the time, but the idea of like somebody just like coming up and kissing me and I don't know that it's gonna happen like at the first kiss is kind of like terrifying. To me.
Yeah, like the Hollywood version of like,
Yeah, I'm like, how do you know? Like, it's like the lean in, and like, like that's never happened for me. It's always been a question, and I genuinely appreciate that. So, but like, there's been times where things weren't like I've had like. It's not like someone has asked me every time, like the first time that we hold hands or the first time that we've hugged or different things. Like there's just different levels as you go along or when you're making out with somebody and you're getting physical and like more is happening. Like there's levels and there's like I've had like partners where they'll like ask consistently, like we're kissing and we like move to a different position and they'll say like, is this okay with you? Or they'll be like, is it okay if I do this? And it's like, I get the chance to then say yes or no. Or I've even had someone ask like, what do you feel comfortable with doing in this interaction, essentially? Or like, what, like now that we have crossed this line in our relationship, what do you feel comfortable with now? And, I think that that's really valuable and really like makes me feel so safe.
Yeah.
Because I mean, in the past, a relationship that I had when I was like in my late teenage / early 20 era of life, a relationship that I had back then, there were so many situations where that boyfriend would try to breach my consent and I would have to like block him multiple times. It would be like we had talked about it before. We had said, okay, we're not going to cross this line. And then he would try to cross it and I would have to stop and say, no, I feel guilty. I feel like I'm the party pooper because I'm saying no. And he feels like he's making me feel bad for saying no to something that we had already talked about not doing.
right.
Which is like, that's a whole different like can of worms of just like manipulation and like, really like coercion within a relationship, and that makes you not want to do things. Like that made me like I would have like emotional breakdowns around us being physical because I was so concerned with like I because I felt violated, you know, in like not being able to have my consent respected, and that's like it's so much better to have the opportunity to say yes or no in a situation and to be able to conversate. Like, I think that one thing that, like, you're talking about the Hollywood, the movie portrayals of, like, what it looks like to have an intimate experience, a lot of times that is cut out and you don't realize, like, how much talking there is in, like, a sexual interaction. How much
for
there
sure.
is that people conversate.
It's never in the Hollywood version that, like, anybody's having any sort of communication at all. And so, like, this sort of, like, awkward, like... version of sex
what
where
is
it's
that?
just like breaths.
I'm sorry.
Just breathing on each other?
Just breaths and music. You know, like that's what Hollywood sex is.
That
It's
took
like,
me a second.
You know,
I mean like moaning, maybe, and like
whatever.
kissing noises.
But actually, like I've been surprised to find like we talk a lot during sex. We laugh a lot during sex.
Yes.
We have like fun and interactions. Yeah, it's not like this sort of like otherworldly experience where words have no more meaning, you know?
Yeah.
Like,
No,
it's like,
100%.
no, we actually still
We talk with our
have,
mouths.
linguistic abilities.
And our bodies.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
and like there's a balance in that. Like there's a balance in like, because it's not like I've like asked someone like every single time that I would touch them, like, is it okay that I do this? You know, but like I'm feeling it out, and we're talking about what our boundaries are. We're talking about what we feel comfortable with. We're talking about what we've done in past relationships and how that applies to this situation now. Like, and then we're talking about how that progresses as we grow in emotional connection, and as we like progress in the relationship. There might be things that I'll consent to that I wouldn't have consented to before.
Yep.
And it can change.
It can change. I had a light bulb moment while you were talking.
Yes.
And I want to throw this
right here above your head, a little light bulb.
I'm so glad. I want to throw it out there and hear your guys' thoughts. There's a lot of talk in Christian culture about couples that have sex before they get married and how in their marriage there's broken trust. And I'm like, oh, actually that's probably broken and boundaries and violated boundaries, not because you guys had sex, but because maybe there wasn't consent. Maybe there wasn't that like safety that was cultivated. Because honestly, like pre-marriage, like purity culture said no. Kelly would have said yes. Like I'd be like, let's get busy. Sorry, Kellyanne. But like, I don't know. I was just thinking about that because like, that is a thing, I feel like, with Christian boys and men of like, oh, well, we set this boundary, but like, I'm going to cross it.
Yeah, I think that can exist for people that don't have sex before marriage as well.
Yes.
Because even if, you didn't cross boundaries, then it doesn't mean that once you enter into the marriage bed that either of you has any understanding of consent and mutual respect.
Totally.
Because you haven't practiced it prior to your marriage either.
Totally.
But I do think that in cases where that sexual trust is broken prior to marriage, the church would like to blame the premarital sexual act.
Yes.
Where often I think it could be, that like
violated trust.
That violated trust and lack of boundaries or violation of boundaries.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah.
1,000%.
I actually was talking to someone about this the other day, and I was listening to a Christian couple. They were talking about how, like, what it looked like for them when they were in the dating stage of their life. They're now married, but they were talking about what it was like when they dated. Both of them had sex in prior relationships and then chose to not have sex in their relationship prior to marriage. And the man specifically kept saying things like, well, like, if you give a man sex before marriage, then he is not, you're not going to be able to have the like relational aspects of your relationship. You're not going to have the same emotion, like they're not going to care about you in that way.
Sure.
They're not going to stay with you.
There's been like that idea that like if he's already gotten the sex, then
yes, it's
why
like he
would
wants
want
the sex.
marriage?
He won't do anything else.
Yeah.
And I talked to them about it, and I was like, it seems like you're giving guys so little credit on the one hand. And it sounds to me like you're talking about like one night stands maybe. But I look at like someone who's in a long-term relationship, someone who feels like trusted within that relationship, and in those situations having sex, why would it be why would they just, like, you think that man would just leave because he acquired sex after you've been together for X amount of time and you've built all this trust and relationship and enjoy one another, like that a man would just leave? And they were kind of like, oh. And it was very like, they didn't really have an answer to that. And I think that is key, because if a couple has said, we are not going to have sex before marriage, and that is disrespected, 100% I can see how that would bring issues into a marriage afterwards. That this trust has been broken. I know that you don't respect me enough to value my word and my consent and my body in that way. That's how I felt in that past relationship, where it was like, we've talked about the things that we feel comfortable with doing, and you keep trying to push that boundary, and it's hurting our relationship in all aspects.
Right, because now I can't trust your word, and I can't trust your respect of my word.
Yes.
And there's a lot of,
yes,
a lot of
and I think that is what people look at, and like you said, they'll say, oh, well, that is because they had sex before marriage.
Yeah.
I don't see how that affects that.
It's actually because they don't, like, they haven't been practicing consent.
Yes.
Yeah, it's all the things tied to the sex. It's
and
not
like,
about the act of
if you want to not have sex before marriage, like, go for it.
Right.
Like, don't have sex before marriage.
Right.
But be in a safe situation where you're able to talk about that and to have conversations, to set boundaries, to put, whatever sort of precautions that you have to take to ensure that you guys keep your words to one another, because you have mutual respect and love for one another.
Yep.
And if you say, oh, actually, we do want to have sex, navigate what that looks like and how to have consent within that, how to respect one another's bodies. Like, it's about respect and trust more than about whether or not you have, like, committed a sexual act.
Yeah.
And I think that's the part where purity culture misses the mark in a lot of ways. But I think that what's true of consent in the no also has to be true in the yes, right? So if you truly don't have choice and you are bound by, like, I don't know, a set of rules or principles or social obligations to only make one decision, then you're not truly giving consent. Even if you're always saying no, right?
Yeah.
Like,
denying
your
you
yes.
haven't made, like, an educated decision.
Yes,
really.
yeah. And denying your yes, I think, can be just as much a violation of yourself as denying.
Absolutely.
There's so much trauma that can come with that.
Yeah.
Like, as we talked about in our episodes about purity culture and our episode reviewing the book Pure by Linda K. Klein, there's so much residual damage that can come from that suppression as well.
Yes.
Because that's not consensual.
Right.
No.
Like, that is something that has been forced upon so many people to say, this is the way that you must live. And they don't get the choice to think, is this the way I want to live?
Yes.
Is this the way that feels safe to live? Is this the way that feels good to me? Does this feel holy to me even?
Yeah.
Like, that is so much, like, there's so much just, like, damage that comes from that, and that manifests itself in your marriage. If you do get married, that manifests itself in choosing to later on have sex with partners after, like, coming out of that purity culture. It's
mind-boggling.
Yeah.
It's literally a mental minefield.
Yeah.
And if you think maybe that's not true, I can attest. Like, that is my life.
Yeah.
Undoing the suppression of my yes is like, oh my gosh, you are, like, I, like, shut down my body to succeed in quote-unquote purity.
Right.
Yeah.
And I actually would probably argue that a couple that mutually makes the decision to have sex prior to marriage in a healthy, consensual way are probably set up for much better success than the couple
100%.
that says no up until the moment and never
So much more
understood
healthier.
the power
that
of
says
their
no
yes.
because they've been told they
Yes.
must,
Yeah.
Yes.
rather than because that is what
Right.
they want.
Because again, I don't think healthy boundaries are about the sexual act before or after marriage. I think they happen on either end.
Yes.
And yes, if you have unhealthy boundaries before marriage, you're likely to have unhealthy boundaries after. If you have healthy boundaries before, you're more likely to have healthy boundaries after. And I think regardless of whether sex takes place in any of those spots, it's more about the boundaries and the mutual respect and the understanding of each other's like dignity and worth as a person than it is. Anyways, I'm on a soapbox here.
No,
but
it's good.
like I think that to me is one of the biggest concerns with purity cultures. I don't think it leaves room for consent at all.
Yep.
Because if you're never able to say no or never able to say yes, then your no could be a violation of yourself, and your yes could be a violation of your I don't know.
Everything else.
And so you kind of live in perpetual shame, and you don't express your bodily needs, and you don't you lose connection with your body. There's tons of...
It's crazy.
Anyways, I know not everybody experiences the type of trauma that Kellyanne and I have talked about growing up in purity culture. Emma some as well, but it is a very real and common, I would say majority common experience of women growing up in that space. So
I would agree for sure. The church, purity culture, I mean, consent to me all around is just like an important conversation that needs to be being had on all sides. But there's one in particular that I feel like isn't talked about a lot, and I'm curious to know both of y'all's thoughts. And it is, when do you think kids should learn about consent? What do you think that conversation should look like? Because, I mean, personally, I am all for educating kids about their bodies from a very young age. I think little boys should know that they have a penis and why, and girls should know, like, you have a vagina and, like, why and what that means for you. And obviously the conversation around gender and things is evolving in our culture, which I think is great, and there's different ways to navigate that. But I think understanding your body is very important. But what about consent?
I think kids should learn about consent as early as they can learn about everything else in the world. I mean, from the very start. And that doesn't mean you sit down a 2-year-old and say, if someone tries to have sex with you, this is what you say. But you practice, asking for consent from them. Practice letting them know, like, you can say no if you don't feel comfortable with something.
Yep.
I think that it all ties in with things like sexual education and teaching kids actual anatomical body parts, so that then they know if someone touches their vagina, that they can say, you're touching my vagina. I don't want that. No. And they can know that is what that is, because that is one of the ways that people will prey on children, is because they have a lack of knowledge.
Yep.
And they'll be able to tell a kid, no, this is okay. Like, I've even heard it described with child sexual assault is the child thinks, well, I guess this is just what the adults do. So I'm sort of being welcomed into the club now of the adults in being inappropriately touched by older people. And so it's so important for a child to have an understanding of consent. I think that there is a little bit of gray area. One example that I've heard used is like, okay, if a parent is teaching a child consent and teaching them like, oh, you could say no if I want to give you a hug or something like that. There are times where the parent needs to say like, no, you need to hold my hand while we cross the street because it's for your safety. Right. Or you need to allow me to pick you up right now to get you in this other situation because this is not safe.
Yep.
Like, I think that there's instances where children don't really get consent from that because their parent is trying to protect them or trying to guide them in something that they might not really understand. But I think that it's really valuable for a kid to have the ability to give consent. Or even if it's like, I mean, I think that you can parse it out so much because there's so many little things. But like, if you made broccoli that night and your kid's like, I don't want broccoli. It's like, no, you have to eat your broccoli. But like, you're also not going to like choke your child with broccoli. Like, because that is kind of abusive. But you're not going to like, cater to a child's temper tantrum in the name of consent.
Right.
So I think there's a lot of gray area in that. But I also like have friends who are in the education space who have worked with really young children, and they have to teach them like, hey, Johnny, Luke said that he didn't like it when you touched his hand, and Luke didn't consent to you touching his hand. So Johnny, you need to respect Luke's consent here and respect his no, because we don't do things to people that they don't want us to do to them. So that's not appropriate because you didn't get their consent. And that, like, just little things like that are so valuable in empowering a child to then become a teenager, a young adult that is able to give consent in more extreme situations.
Right.
Yeah, I think the temptation is the assumption that kids don't have bodily autonomy, right? Like, as your dad, if I'm going to hold you down and, you know, whatever, I don't know, like, change your pants, I'm going to do that. And there are cases where you would need to do that. Like, you peed your pants, we got to, like, we're going to change you. I know that you're, you know, having a tantrum right now, but, like, this is, you know, beyond your choice. So there is a level of that. And I think as a child grows and matures, allowing them more autonomy is a part of the process of growing up. And so I think when people hear about consent with children, they think that the you know, they think of the extreme being like, oh, yes, let your kids run free and make their own choices. And I don't think that's always the case. Like, we're going to decide whether or not our child will receive a vaccination, and we're going to decide whether or not we're going to take them to the doctor for this specific thing, or, you know, change their diaper, or et cetera, pick them up, or, you know, whatever those things are.
But I think even, like, communicating with them in those situations, like, I've heard about parents who will communicate, like, okay, I'm going to take your pants off now, and I'm going to pull off your underwear, and I'm going to wipe your butt. Like, just telling them and talking them through it so that they have an understanding of what's happening. And then I think that's helpful, too, if, you know, God forbid, they're in a situation where someone is trying to sexually violate them. They know the difference between, like, their parent just, like, wiping their butt and, like, helping to clean them versus, like, somebody touching them inappropriately in that same area.
Right.
And I'm sure that there are tons of great resources out there for any parent.
We are not parenting experts.
For any parent who's looking for how to navigate the consent space, go there. And, you know, but my opinion, one thing I know is to be true is, like, growing up, there were some cases where I didn't have choice, where I feel like I wish I had known I did. Particularly in the case I've talked about in friendships, with family members, with people in the church, even, like, people that you're supposed to be able to trust. And so your parents kind of let their guard down a little bit. Because I didn't always feel like I could say no. And Ross and I have talked about this because, you know, in our wide family, you know, whatever, extended family, there are some kids within the family that are required to hug their grandparents or their aunts and uncles or whatever, and they don't get a choice, even though there's a lot of times where they don't want to hug
Grandma and grandpa.
Grandma and grandpa or aunt and uncle or whatever, because they're shy, they don't know them as well, whatever. And I think there are some cases like that where I think at some point that child becomes old enough to be able to say, no, I don't want to hug from grandpa or grandma or whoever. And I think that, like, teaching the kid to respect themselves and teaching the adults to respect the kid is really important.
Totally.
Because, yeah, if your teacher wants to hug you in a weird way, you should be able to know that you have the right to say no.
Yeah. You know? No, I completely agree. Like, our family, and this isn't a knock to my family
not
at all.
Yeah.
But a lot of them are like, oh, you give, you know, hugs because that's respectful or that's kind or whatever. And I'm like,
it's like we're family, so we must.
Totally. But I'm like, oh, if my kids, if I have kids, if they don't want to hug my mom and dad, I'm like, that's okay. Like, actually, even if I won't even force you to hug me, like, because that's very selfish of me. Like, I'm trying to get my, like, physical touch desire that I have for my child met, like, by force, you know?
Yeah. And I think, like, there's nuance there for sure.
Totally.
There are some cases where, like, okay, no, you don't get to just have an attitude about this. Like, be polite or,
totally,
you know, whatever. But yeah,
an attitude's very different than refusal of physical touch.
Especially to a relative that someone doesn't know well or, you know. But, I think, again, there's nuance. Every parent is empowered to make the best decision for their child.
Totally.
And there's tons of professionals out there who will give you great advice on how to navigate this decision. But I think overall, in response to the question, like, I agree. I think kids should be learning about consent from the very beginning. I think communicating really clearly, even before they have the language to speak, is important. Like, they actually can understand a lot more than they can speak when they're really young.
Right.
And giving them that, you know, respect and dignity is just a part of treating them like a human and teaching them how to grow up into a well-balanced human.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I will say that I do empathize to an extent with a parent really wanting their child to give them physical touch. Like when I've had, relationships with kids that like I'm friends with the family or whatever, like it like stings to like have a kid be like, no, I don't want to hug you right now, or like or like, no, I don't want to like, and it feels like, ooh, oh, okay, I guess like that sort of like, oh, it hurts my heart a little bit to like not to not feel that like reciprocated affection from the child. And like children are like cuddly and like sweet, and I can get why a parent would want to be like, no, like, come on, like, give me a hug, or like, no, like, they want to, like, I guess I empathize with that and why that would feel difficult to be like, okay with your child saying no to like, to cuddling with you or to a hug or different things like that. And I think that, like Kelly has said multiple times now, like, there is a lot of nuance in that. There are lots of like parenting sort of methodologies and theories about like how to do this really well. But I get why a parent might want to, sort of, I mean, I feel like force is a strong word, but to sort of like
encourage,
like really encourage their kid to still give them that like physical affection, because like you love your child so much. Like I can't even imagine. Like I feel like so much love well up in my heart for like different kids that I've known, and like to imagine that with a parent, like you'd want so badly to be able to like have that physical affirmation of that love with them. And so I get that to an extent. And sympathize on how that could feel. I feel like a parent might balk at the idea of being like allowing your kid to say no to those things.
Totally.
But I also see like how valuable that can be too.
Totally. I mean, I again don't have kids, might not have kids. I speak to the way I wish I had been parented. Actually, like being forced to snuggle or being forced to hug actually makes me feel scared of you. And like the fact that you are so much stronger than me, or that, this uncle makes me feel uncomfortable, but, every time I see him, I'm expected to give him a hug, like those things. And like, I understand, like, I don't know, like from a parent perspective, I speak from like a child perspective.
Yeah.
Like knowing what that experience is. And yeah, I mean, and there are times where you will probably have to violate that at some level, like, because there are gray areas.
Yeah, it's a balance of trusting your child's intuition and teaching them what is good for them, right? Because I think we all know that if we let our kids make all the decisions in the world, they are like kind of psychopaths, and they would destroy the earth.
They would.
Each other,
the earth.
and everybody.
They would ruin everything.
And so, like, the importance of teaching them, this is why we hug our family, and it's important, this is how we show love, this is polite, things like that. This is a really good way for you to show grandma that you care about her. Things like that are important. Because I think just being like, oh, yes, child, of course you know what's best for yourself. Please run on the glass, obviously is not good parenting, and that's neglectful. So there, again, that finding that good balance of, I know what's best for you, but like,
But you're also, you should, I think, a really great parent would be teaching their kid to learn what's best for themselves as well.
And that's what I'm trying to say.
You're teaching them how to think critically. You're teaching them how to navigate situations and know what they want. Like, that's part of raising a child.
Right.
Totally. Yeah. And I think I'm totally in agreement. There's tons of nuance. I mean, it even makes me think of, there's a family here in our town that I'm very close with, and I go and hang out with their kids quite often, and their oldest wanted to come out with me while I took the trash out to the dumpster. And I was like, sure, absolutely, just come with me, it's fine. But after I threw the trash into the dumpster, I looked down and realized there's glass on the ground. and he didn't have shoes on. And I told him, hey, I need you to stand still. This is really dangerous for you. And he just wanted to play and have fun and didn't listen. I think he was about 6. And so I picked him up and I was like, okay, I'm really sorry, but I need to pick you up right now. And he was like, Kelly, oh my gosh, why are you doing this? Blah, blah, blah. Kelly Ann. And I put him down on the porch and I was like, I'm so sorry, like, that I had to do that. It was for your safety. And I explained to him, there's glass on the ground. You didn't have shoes on. I was very scared that you were going to hurt yourself and cut your feet, and I didn't want you to be hurt. And I think, that is a great example where there's tons of nuance for what's best for a child or what's safe. And obviously, I would never want someone to put their child in a compromising situation for the sake of consent. Like safety comes first. But I think, there's a lot of things in parenting that I would just challenge. And I know it's very easy for me as on the sidelines to challenge things. I'm not doing it. I think communication is really important, though, between you and your child. And I know there's probably rarely time. You're going to lose your temper. You're tired. You're like, dear God, when can I just have a moment to myself? And explaining something again for the 80th time is probably grinding your gears. But I think when your child truly understands, that's when that's what they're going to remember. They're going to remember, oh, mom cared to actually tell me this. And it might have taken me a lot because I was really young, but eventually it clicked. And I think that is the value to me, at least.
Well, that reminds me, too, I grew up around a lot of animals because my mom is an animal trainer. And I learned a little bit about consent through, her handling of animals, right? Because we were all kids and we're crazy, and kids are like, I'm going to grab this dog by the ears and pull it as hard as I can, and that'll be fun, and you're not thinking,
this dog's going to bite me if I do that.
Or, you're not even thinking about the dog. And I remember my mom would often say to me or my siblings, how do you think the dog feels when you pull its ears or when you sit on it or whatever? Can you tell that the dog is scared right now?
Yeah.
And so that was actually, to me, I think, an important lesson I learned in, animal consent. I don't know, it's maybe, a little bit too extreme to go in that direction. But, the idea that this is another being, they have feelings, they experience fear, they experience the same types of things as you. And so I think that developed in me a compassion for other people and animals, etc., that we don't always teach. We sort of some people let their people do whatever they want to their animals. And I think there's a value in being okay, what's right for you and also what's right for the dog. We don't hit the dog.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's really valuable in the conversation around nonverbal consent.
Yes.
Because I think, again, going back to that trope that people have about, consent is just this really formal, blah, blah, blah. But there is, you can use the analogy of someone reading a dog and the way that they're reacting to things that you're doing. It's very similar in reading a person if they are reacting negatively to the things that you're doing to them. And that is still not consent, I'm not just going to go up to a dog that I don't know and just start manhandling them because this dog might bite me and or this dog might react really poorly. I don't know what this dog is used to or what they do. They might be a perfectly kind dog, but if I'm going to go and violate them in that way, it could trigger something. And so I think there's that idea of your own safety with that, but also, I mean, the dog that lives in my house right now, that dog will get upset if I sit in its spot, but so I'm reading how the dog's reacting to that and how the dog is interacting with me from that, and there's drawing lines, and there's also, I think it's a valuable analogy for recognizing how nonverbal consent can work and how reading somebody's reactions is really, really helpful in consent.
Totally.
And I think also just the idea that teaching your child about other people's consent can help them internalize it for themselves as well.
Totally.
That dog or that friend or whatever. Can you tell that your friend is not having a good time.
Yeah,
when
they're not
you,
comfortable.
Yeah.
Well,
that
and
sort of thing.
I think kids are so, kind of to what you were saying earlier, Emma, is like, I think kids are so eager and willing to love and show kindness. I think you just have to tell them how. It's like, hey, mom really loves it when you give me a hug. Like, that makes my day. And like, your kid's going to remember that and be like, oh my gosh, I want to make my mom's day. Like, you know, and it might not always be in the way that you want, but I think ultimately you're raising a little person. Like, and so, anyways.
I'm actually curious to pivot a little bit. One thought that I had was, do you guys feel like the pandemic and COVID have changed a bit how we interact with consent? One thing that I was thinking about is how I feel like there's more liberty to say no now to physical interaction because you can sort of stand behind, well, like, I don't want to spread germs, you know, like, I don't want to, like, I don't feel comfortable shaking your hand right now. I don't feel comfortable giving you a hug because I'm trying to be safe. But I also think that that has become politicized in a lot of ways where it's like, oh, if you don't consent to this, then you must be this type of person politically, or you must be XYZ because of the way that you're giving consent to a physical interaction here.
Yep. Yeah, I would agree with you. It has become politicized. I feel like a lot of things about the pandemic have become politicized.
For sure.
Maybe all of the pandemic has become politicized. And I think, but that is something I've talked about amongst my workplace, actually, of like, hey, I actually do things outside of work that are really, really valuable to me. If you come into work sick and I'm not consenting to that, like, I've used this verbiage, like, you're actually ruining my chances of things that I could be doing outside of work, and that sucks for me.
Yeah.
Like, it actually doesn't make sense for a sick person to come into the office and healthy people to have to go home because of that sick person.
Yeah.
Like, how is that cool or fair to anyone?
And it's a breach of your consent.
Exactly. And so I have actually because that's what I have verbally said to people. And I've recalibrated a lot of how I think about those things of like, actually, no, like, if, you know, I'm not feeling well, I'm not going to go to the grocery store, even if I am wearing a mask. I'm actually just going to go ahead and
DoorDash
or Instacart and thinking about those things because like everyone else matters too. And so I'm like, yeah, it sucks to have to pay the extra cash for like, you know, a delivery service. Which is
definitely a position of privilege to be able to do that.
Sure.
Well, I just want to like recognize that because it's not like everyone necessarily has access to being able to like Instacart groceries or things like that. But there's a lot of different precautions that you can take to like ensure that you're respecting other people and their bodies and their like right to not get sick or to, you know, feel safe out in public. That also don't require, you know, money.
Right. Totally. And like, my thing is like, not only are you disrespecting me, you're disrespecting everyone else in that space if you choose to show up sick.
And I think that's what's been really great about the pandemic is that businesses have been forced to allow people to work from home when sick or offer sick pay when during the pandemic, because that's a huge issue, especially for people in low income jobs, is not having the option of staying home. And because they don't have access to sick pay or because they're out of sick pay or, you know,
whatever reason,
they don't have the benefit or whatever. And so they don't have a choice. They have to come to work if they're going to pay their bills and feed their family or whatever it is they need in their life. And it doesn't even have to be that dire. Like some people just have to go to work so they can maintain their quality of life that they've built, you know? And so I think it's super important now that businesses have been required to make allowances for people who can't show up to work due to sickness and making more work from home options available and all of that. Because I think that's been primarily the issue that I've seen like in the past. I remember even before the winter before the pandemic hit, there's a huge like flu virus that went through
Oh my God.
our workplace. And there's one girl who showed up with a fever because she wasn't given the option of staying home to work from home. And she didn't want to take the time off because she probably couldn't afford it or needed the money. And so like her boss basically told her, if you're sick, you stay home. If you're not, you come to work, but there's no in between.
Jeez.
And so she was forced to come to work sick. And that put everybody else in a compromising position.
Right.
So I think that's a huge piece of it. And I think that's not often recognized. It's not always just a personal decision of, do I go to work or not? It's often
Totally.
like, people have to make money, you know?
Totally. And I've been in that position. Like, I have
I totally
so
know how
much
that feels. It
empathy
sucks.
for that. It really does suck. I think the pandemic, though, has changed the conversation around that probably forever, which I think is amazing. And I don't judge you if you have to go to work, because if you don't show up, you'll lose your job or you don't get sick pay or whatever. Like, there's no judgment there, but there is judgment on your employers and your managers that are not allowing that.
Yeah.
And but I think it's fair to say, if you have the option to work from home and your
it.
employers allow it and you show up to work sick, come on.
Yeah.
Come on, bro.
Yeah. I mean, you're disrespecting everyone else in the workplace, and they did not consent to that.
Yep.
They didn't. And like you were saying, Kellyanne, like it's then compromising all other aspects of your daily life.
Yeah. And not to mention my own personal health, which I've also been very vocal about. Like, hey, I actually have health things going on. It could be really bad for me if I were to get COVID. Thank God I haven't yet. So could you actually help me out and like manage yourself? And so I just think of people like me that could even have it worse than me. Like, I'd probably make it, you know? But there are people that if they were to get COVID, they might not make it. And like...
Or think about if somebody has an elderly family member that lives with them.
Yeah.
Or it's like, oh, like we're all young, healthy people in our workplace. It doesn't matter if we get COVID. But like, what you don't know about all the other circumstances that they have that come along with that.
Yeah.
Or what if somebody has an autoimmune disease that you don't know about, you know? Or like there's...
Yeah.
Anyways, that's like sort of tangential, but there's a lot of factors.
People can look really healthy, and you actually don't know what's going on in their life.
Yeah.
But no, I agree.
Point being, yes, I think the pandemic has played a role in how we view consent. I think I feel a lot more comfortable to like move over on the sidewalk and not walk close to somebody.
Yeah.
Whereas before, I think that would have been construed as
rude or standoffish or whatever.
Yeah. And I appreciate that. I don't have to walk near people that I don't know.
Yeah. Or someone who I've literally had people like who are like hacking on the street, and I'm like,
oh my gosh,
I'm going to walk far away from you.
Yeah, for sure. So then, interesting to follow up this convo, this question. What do you do? How do you handle conversations when consent is violated? Like, when someone crosses a boundary, like, how do you navigate that? How have you navigated that?
Well, there's a difference between how do I and how should I. I just want to acknowledge that right off the get-go, because I think my inclination when consent is violated is to say nothing, unless there's like a trusting relationship there. But, it's to say nothing, wait for it to become a serious problem, and then like, explode about it and have to work it out later on, in trauma therapy or something.
Okay.
Not that, sorry, that sounds way more intense than it should. But yeah, I tend to kind of like avoid or sort of distance myself from people that violate consent more so than directly addressing it, which is not necessarily the best way forward. Although in some situations it could be, your only options. There's nothing wrong with not directly.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's situations where it is safe to directly address a non-consensual act.
Sure.
And there's situations where it's not. And the safest thing is to distance yourself from that person or that situation. I think that there's levels of relational equity. And I think like I said before, I tend to feel more comfortable saying it in romantic settings. I think because consent is often talked about in a romantic setting and like a physical
it's less taboo,
intimacy.
more expected, yeah.
Whereas like I described before, hugging somebody that I don't really know very well in a situation where it's like, well, everyone else is also like hugging or whatever. And so I would be the weird, uptight person if I don't want that.
Yeah.
Then I just sort of have bared through it, you know? And I think that there's a lot in like navigating whether you decide somebody is safe to be around, whether you might, if they consistently violate your consent, then you might just need to, you know, remove them from your life if possible, or find ways to distance yourself from them or put yourself in situations where you're not alone with them, or like avoid situations of being alone with them. But it's hard, and I feel like there's a lot of ways to respond, and it's very fluid when it comes to your consent being broken. If it's something you've talked explicitly about, I think I'll often fall back on, hey, we talked about this, like, I don't feel comfortable with XYZ happening. Let's not do that. But I think that I can also fall into feeling like, well, like, what did I do to cause this to happen? Especially within like in that relationship I talked about from when I was a lot younger, it was a lot of like, well, like, it's my fault too, like that we've crossed these physical boundaries. Like it's like we shouldn't have been, you know, kissing that much or something, or, you know, like a little, because that just led to more than we were supposed to do. And like those kinds of situations, I think there can be a lot of like self-blaming and self-shame. But I think that is a natural response. But I think that I've learned a lot in trying to give myself, you know, some grace within that.
Yeah, for sure. And I don't mean to shit on myself for sure, but I do think that there is a level of me that could be a little bit more forthcoming when it comes to like, hey, I don't really want to hug, or like, you know, I tend to just grin and bear a lot of things with people that I don't trust specifically. But
I think that I tend to try to communicate that with my body language a lot too.
Sure.
In not really giving opportunities for somebody
Sure.
that I already know that I actively don't want to touch.
Sure.
In being fairly like obvious with the way that I'm interacting with them in general. And I think that can be helpful, but it's not always the most effective.
And I think that applies to like consent can be violated and it's my fault. Right. I think that happens. And I've been in situations where it's like, oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize that you do not appreciate a hug, or you do not appreciate whatever. I'm so sorry. And then I think it's my job to take responsibility for that and not do it.
Yeah.
You know, like
100%.
I think it's super important. I don't know.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. And I mean, anytime someone's been like, hey, that was not comfortable for me, I'm like, oh my gosh, like devastated. Because I would never want to feel that way. And so I would hate to make anyone else feel that way. And so I think the way you handle violated consent goes both ways. It's very important. But also, like, I am also of the agreement. I'm pretty slow to let people in. And I've kind of watched you and tested you, and I know kind of how you're going to handle stuff in general. I mean, of course, you can't know everything, but like, you know, so I feel like I haven't been put in many situations where I have to be like, yo, you violated my consent. That was messed up. But also, like, is that person, sometimes I've had to ask the question, is this person worth actually communicating this and going through like the emotional distress, if you will, of the situation? Or am I actually just going to like put up a little bit of a boundary and just create a little bit of distance? I think both are healthy. in their own prospects. But if it's someone I truly like am connected to and cared about, I'm like, oh, heck yeah, I'll tell them. Because I think I owe that to the relationship. But anyways, ladies, we've talked about it all. We've talked about kids. We've talked about purity culture, as always. When can we not bring that up? We've talked about the workplace. We've talked about COVID. Oh my gosh.
Sexy consent.
Sexy consent. Is it sexy? Is it not?
Sexy consent.
Non-sexy consent and the difference.
What are your takeaways from today's conversation? I mean, we've covered so much.
No means no.
No means no.
It's a good takeaway.
And yes means yes. But yes needs to be mutual, and no doesn't. That's my takeaway.
It's a good takeaway.
I think for me, the takeaway is that I think consent is a word that tends to specifically refer to sexual interaction. And I think the concept of it is actually so much broader and bigger and applies to so many more areas of life than just sexuality. Violated consent can sound very extreme in the wording, but it could be just something as simple as, oh, I side hugged this person. They're not super interested in being hugged. I'm sorry. That's okay. Let's move on. Like, it does not have to result in, like, 20 years of therapy and a, rape allegation and, a whole falling out and everyone gets fired. And, so I think, like, maybe I feel like it's lowered the stakes of consent a lot because I think it is more of a lifestyle and a way of being considerate to others than it is specific to rape. And so I think that'd be my takeaway, and that would be the takeaway that I hope people would walk away with is consent is more about being considerate of others, understanding that they may not carry the same preferences as you. And if you're going to have tea and they don't want tea, that's okay.
Don't pour tea down anyone's throat.
Yeah. Super simple.
Any kind of tea. Sexual tea.
Sexuality.
Conversational tea.
You spilled the tea.
Yeah. So, yeah, I think...
Which actually, I have had consent come in situations like that, of spilling the tea, in terms of talking about...
Yes.
Maybe other people or like just gossiping in general. I have actively said, hey, I don't feel comfortable talking about these people in this way. I don't want to have this conversation. I don't feel comfortable talking about this group and bashing them. I just don't. And I think that's another thing which we didn't really touch on, but like I think that's another form of consent is saying like, I don't really want to be part of this conversation. This isn't the kind of thing I want to hear. This isn't the kind of thing I want to participate in.
Yep.
I don't want to do it. And that's super valuable.
I think the big thing is it doesn't hurt to ask. It doesn't hurt to say, okay, so I have some tea. Do you want to hear?
Yeah.
Which my answer will always be, yes. Tell me right now.
Or like, so, me and Ross last night, do you mind if I talk about my sexual life? Things like that. Very simple. Like, is this going to make you uncomfortable if I talk about, So I think, it just applies to the idea that I'm a person, my unique experience and perspective is probably different than the people around me, and I can expect that, they might have a different preference, and so I can check in to find out. And if that's the case, great, we'll move on, we'll do something else. It doesn't have to be like this sort of like falling out, devastating. Oh, they didn't consent and now it's awkward, Sometimes that may be the case. But like sometimes you invite someone over and they don't want your tea and it's awkward. And then they leave and you're like,
sometimes,
I misread that situation.
Yeah. Better to have some awkwardness though than the other option.
Oh,
for sure.
100%.
1,000%.
Sometimes a man might touch your back and you say, remove your hand, please, good sir. And
good fellow.
He goes, whoop, my bad. And you're like, yep.
No worries.
Don't do it again, thanks.
Yeah, for sure.
And so, yeah, for sure.
And one last takeaway, which you may have this takeaway. I'm so sorry if I took all the takeaways.
No.
But the last takeaway is be conscious of the position of power that you're in and how that might influence other people. And that is it.
No, that's really good. I don't know that I have more takeaways to add. Yeah, definitely don't. But those are all great takeaways, and I agree with all of them. Maybe you, very much like the wine analogy in Schitt's Creek, where he's, she was like, do you like red wine? I like red wine. And he's like, well, I like red wine, and I like white wine, and I like a good rosé, and sometimes, I'd get crazy with a Merlot. So that conversation serving as a bridge to talk about sexuality. Tea can serve as a great conversational piece to talk about consent. So I think those simple analogies that are easy for people to understand, everyone understands them, is really great. And so with all that being said, I think we're going to wrap up this conversation around consent, but you, the listener, should go ahead and consent to giving us a review and a follow on Instagram.
You must consent.
You should consent.
Now we will coerce you to consent to this.
But no, you will constantly be reminded that you have the option for tea. You do not need tea, but you have the option for tea from us.
The tea in this situation is a review.
Is a review.
Apple Podcasts.
But honestly, no, it really does help us out. So we would appreciate it if you're interested. So with all that being said, though, I think we're going to wrap this up and we'll catch you next time.
We'll catch you guys next time.
Bye.
We'll catch you guys next time.
We'll catch you guys next time.
If you want us to.
If you consent, we'll be here.
We'll be here.
We're consenting.
With tea.
Waiting for your consent. Yes or no?